Welcome back, everybody. This is Mr. Cummings, and we'll be tackling APUSH Period 4 today for the upcoming AP exam. It's going to take us from 1800 to 1848. Thomas Jefferson's election, conclusion of the Mexican-American War. Chock full of information in this one. Very important stuff. So we go from President Jefferson, Madison, War of 1812, Missouri Compromise, Louisiana, all kinds of crazy stuff. Expansion of slavery, market revolution. We'll fight some wars, all kinds of crazy stuff. We're going to get into it. Let's not wait any longer. Let's get it. Let's go. For those of you playing the home game, you would have already seen the Period 3 review video that we did, so that will largely be the context for Period 4. Period 4 begins with the election of Thomas Jefferson, so we've already won independence from England. We are the independent United States. We have political parties that have been formed. John Adams and the Federalists, Thomas Jefferson and the Democratic Republicans. We're beginning to industrialize, something that we'll call the market revolution. The entire world is beginning industrialization. We're a little bit behind England, but are one of the first nations to do it and will be a leader very soon in industrialization. We have our eyes to the west. We've had them there since Jamestown, especially so with the proclamation line of 1763. All of that's been wiped away, and it's free, clear sailing for the most part, things like the Louisiana Purchase. And then that will also usher in debates on slavery. Period 3, large national debates were more about size, role, and scope of government, less about slavery, independence, and freedom. Now, as we add westward migration into the equation, that then raises the question of what will these new Western territories be? Will they be free or will they be slave? We'll also look at reform movements tied to industrialization as well, which also drives westward expansion. So lots of intersecting roads here in Period 4, set up by the independence movement of Period 3. We left off with the election of Thomas Jefferson. We'll begin with Thomas Jefferson. Peaceful election in 1800, revolution of 1800. John Adams and the Federalists go out. Thomas Jefferson and the Democratic Republicans come in. Think back to Period 3. We had the slide that showed you the difference between Federalists and Democratic Republicans. TJ is a Democratic Republican, very much focused on agriculture. He's a Virginia plantation owner, and he believes in what's called a yeoman republic. A yeoman basically is a fancy way of saying an individual free landowner. Jefferson really believes true independence is owning your own farm and being beholden to nobody, self-sufficient, and that's the vision he has for the country. Industrialization is dirty, cities are immoral, doesn't want us to be like Europe in his idea, and wants us to be basically the breadbasket of the world. It's a defense mechanism too. England will be less likely to mess with us if they're getting all of their food and raw materials from us. You wouldn't want to do that. Jefferson will run into, it's a bumpy road for TJ with that regard on foreign policy. Number one thing we do need to know, very important, is Louisiana Purchase. TJ sends his boys over, and he basically instructs them, figure out a way to buy New Orleans. We want the port city. It'd be great for us, etc. And his boys come back, and they're like, hey, Tommy, we bought the whole thing. And that's exactly what they did. Unbeknownst to Jefferson, they actually buy all of Louisiana from Napoleon, and this creates a constitutional crisis for TJ. He's a strict constructionist of the Constitution. Where in the Constitution does it say the President of the United States can make a land deal that more than doubles the size of the country? It doesn't. So Jefferson sends it to Congress. Congress looks at it, and they're like, nobody cares. It's a really good deal. Don't worry. Just sign off on it and do it. Boom, it happens. Overnight, we'll more than double the size of the country. Takes France off the continent, takes us off our border, opens up further westward expansion for us. Lewis and Clark will go across and tell us what's out there, at least in the northern half of it. And so this would definitely be in a westward expansion essay. Northwest Territory in Period 3, Louisiana Purchase in Period 4, Texas, Mexican Cession also at the end of Period 4, which we'll get into. Big chunks of westward expansion. Jefferson will struggle foreign policy-wise. Democratic Republicans believe they should have a small army and navy. That's not going to fly when you have people messing with American shipping around the world like the Barbary pirates. So he'll send the Marine Corps over there to take care of business, as they've been doing for the past 200 plus years. And this is why it's in the Marine Corps hymn, from the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli. The Tripoli part is fighting the pirates off the coast of Africa. They are successful. England, as well, is continuing to mess with us. They're harassing our shipping. You got what's known as the Chesapeake Leopard affair. HMS Leopard is the British warship, fires on the American ship right off the coast of the United States, kills some people. They show up. They force American sailors into the British Navy, something called impressment. We're not too happy about it. Jefferson responds, you can't use the military because it's England. Jefferson responds with what's called the Embargo Act, where basically he's saying like the ships can't go to foreign ports, etc. And the whole idea is we're trying to use our economy, our production of raw materials, food, etc., to force countries like England to treat us nicely. This will blow up in Jefferson's face because England specifically has a global empire. They can get their stuff from other parts of the world. This craters our economy, especially those northern commercial-based state economies. You think like Boston as a major shipping point, New York City as a major commercial port as well. Really craters them. And remember, those are also strongholds of the Federalist Party as well. So they're not really going to be fans of this either. So Jefferson, Louisiana Purchase, good. Struggles with the economics early on. And then Madison coming up next will have to inherit that, as well as the War of 1812. So that'll be fun. For you visual learners out there, on the left, you can see the Louisiana Purchase over here. You can see the modern states, which are carved out of it. Best land deal in the history of the United States. Certainly make a strong argument for it. Alaska would be up there as well, with all the gold and oil that's going to come out of that, but that's later. And then you can see the track that Lewis and Clark take to go across the country and let us know what's out there, all the way out to the Pacific and back. So we mentioned Madison, father of the Constitution. He comes after Thomas Jefferson. Both of these guys are Democratic Republican, had a lot of Virginians early on in the presidency, Washington, Jefferson, Madison. Like I said, he is a Democratic Republican. We'll follow in TJ's footsteps regarding diplomacy and economic pressure. Not going to be all that successful, but early on, he's very much consumed with the War of 1812. Why is it called the War of 1812? Because we creatively name things in American history. It occurs in 1812. Primary causes of it: violation of neutrality, England's messing with our shipping, and then the perception is that England's out on the frontier, stoking up the Native Americans to cause trouble for the American settlers out there, and we're not really fans of that either. So we're going to go to war with the English for the second time. Some people call this America's second war for independence or true war for independence. We're going to try to fight and take Canada because we've had our eye on Canada for a while. Fight the Great Lakes. England will come in and burn Washington, D.C. to the ground. That's why the White House is actually white. They had to paint it white to cover up all the scorch marks from the flames. The national anthem comes out of the War of 1812. You got the Francis Scott Key hanging out in a British ship, watching them shell Fort McHenry, which gives you access to Baltimore. And that song is about what he sees. Rockets, red glare, bombs bursting in the air, flag is still there, all that stuff is seen as the flag still flying over the fort. But short of that, we kind of just get handed by England. England suns us, so to speak. Doesn't really go well. Hartford Convention, Federalists get together. Federalists are pro-England. They don't like the war. They're actually still trading with England while we're fighting the English in parts. They debate like constitutional amendments, debate even secession, and that then they'll take that message to D.C. and it will fizzle because we've gotten word of the Battle of New Orleans victory with Andrew Jackson, Treaty of Ghent, which concludes the War of 1812, and everyone kind of looks at the Federalists making all these demands when everyone else is happy about the war's conclusion. So the Hartford Convention equals basically the end of the Federalist Party. So that's definitely something to know if you had a political party essay question. The Treaty of Ghent concludes the war with no real change. England doesn't really address or apologize for the impressment issue. The borders don't change. We don't get anything, but we don't lose, and that's what's important. So if you don't lose, it's kind of a victory, and that's the big thing for the Americans. So we've gone toe-to-toe with the British twice. That's going to gain us respect amongst international countries. The Federalist Party will fade away, in large part due to the Hartford Convention. Indians are on their own. England bails. Good luck. Have fun. You're directly in the crosshairs of the Americans now. We move towards industrial self-sufficiency. We're cut off from England's industrialism, so we have to develop it ourselves, and we begin to do that, which is a good thing. And war heroes become a thing. So you got guys like Andrew Jackson, William Henry Harrison. They will become, both of those guys are future presidents, and they will trade off of and campaign on the idea that they are war heroes. We love war heroes in America. Our country is full of them. Many of them have political success as well, all the way up to like Dwight D. Eisenhower, for example. And also out of the War of 1812, we get increased nationalism. We bump our chests It's all about America. America, man, America. War of 1812, victorious. So after Madison and victory in the War of 1812, we'll get James Monroe, also a Democratic Republican. War of 1812 victory, Federalist Party going out, coins the phrase era of good feelings, because it appears to be that there isn't any big political party strife. The country's all jacked up and proud to be America. We just beat England again. What's up? Not really the case, as most things in our class is we have really nice fancy titles and they're not really accurate. Within the era of good feelings, there is political party friction. The Federalists have gone away, certainly, but the Democrat Republicans start to fracture. They're splitting into a faction called the National Republicans, led by guys like Henry Clay. These basically are Democratic Republicans that have Federalist or Hamiltonian leanings. We'll get into it in a second with Henry Clay, but you know, the American system with a bank, tariffs, those are all very much Alexander Hamilton's ideas. Those guys will ultimately break away eventually and wind up being Whigs with Andrew Jackson in just a few short years. So just keep that at the back of your head. National Republicans fracturing away from Democratic Republicans and ultimately end up as Whigs in case we have a political party essay or something dealing with the evolution of political parties. So Monroe gets the Missouri Compromise, 1820, very important, huge road stop that we have to pause at and make sure we're good on. You have this growing debate in the country over slavery, slave states and free states, and the balance has to be maintained, specifically in the Senate. The North is already getting population advantages that they will never give up. All the way up to the Civil War, the North will have more people. The waves of immigration are coming to those northern industrial cities. They're not coming to Alabama plantations. So the House of Representatives is a lost cause for southern states. They can't win there. The president is a coin flip. It could be a pro-slavery. It could be a pro-anti-slavery or an anti-slavery president. So you can't guarantee that. So the balance has to be maintained in the Senate. So each state has equal representation in the Senate. So the way you maintain the balance is to bring in slave states and free states at the same time so that balance is preserved. And that's ultimately what's going to happen. When Missouri is the first state to apply, it's a slave state out of Louisiana Purchase. And the idea here is they want to be slave states. The Northerners try pushing what's called the Talmadge Amendment, which would have provided for gradual emancipation of slavery. So once slaves reached a certain age, they would then be free and prevented bringing in new slaves. Southerners very much reject that. And this is a trend. Southerners have always rejected attempts to limit or ban slavery all the way back to the time of the Declaration of Independence. The original draft, Jefferson wrote negatively of slavery, and guys like South Carolina were like, we're not signing that. Take it out. So Southerners always, it's a trend, they always push against any form of limitation of slavery. And Henry Clay will hammer out what's known as the Missouri Compromise. Missouri comes in as a slave state, so the Southerners get that. They break Maine off Massachusetts, make that a free state, keeps the balance, and then it prohibits slavery in the remainder of the Louisiana Territory north of the 3630 line, which is just a line on a map. It's basically Missouri's southern border. And the idea here, Southerners are fine with it because if you look at the remainder of the territory in North Dakota, for example, not sure the plantation model will work there given current knowledge and technology. The Northerners are somewhat happy because they do limit the expansion of slavery to a certain degree. So both sides walk away feeling like they kind of got something out of the deal. It maintains the balance, preserves the Union. But yet guys like Jefferson refer to this as he calls it a fire bell in the night, like a warning sign, like holding a wolf by an ear. And the whole idea here is that he's basically saying it's kicking slavery down the road. And ultimately, right, we're going to have to make a decision on that. And he's right, because we're going to get to a point post-compromise of 1850 where nobody wants to compromise anymore. And that's when South Carolina is going to throw up the deuce and try to leave. So that's the Missouri Compromise. Falls under westward expansion, falls under slavery, sectionalism debates, political type stuff, presidents, all of that stuff you could use the Missouri Compromise for in an essay. Very important. Monroe Doctrine, named after James Monroe himself. And basically, Jimmy Monroe is going to stand up there and say, hey, England, Europe, everybody, stay out of the Western Hemisphere. And this is only as strong as America's willing to make it, and only as effective as other people are willing to listen to it. It's not a law, it's not a treaty, it's the president saying, hey, this is what America wants. So it does highlight the United States standing up on the world scene, telling other countries, right, our sphere of influence. and will become much more effective for the United States later on. Teddy Roosevelt, Taft, these guys will use it in Central and South America when you look at things like dollar diplomacy or the Roosevelt corollary, the attachment, the Roosevelt corollaries to the Monroe Doctrine. And John F. Kennedy will actually use it to justify the, quote, quarantine, which is basically a blockade, of Cuba during the missile crisis in the early 1960s. The United States will quote the Monroe Doctrine. So very influential over time, and immediately it's part of that nationalism movement in the United States flexing on other countries around the world, or at least trying to. And so that would be James Monroe. Era of good feelings, Missouri Compromise, Monroe Doctrine. So we'll break up the monotony of president after president after president. We'll switch gears. We'll look at the market revolution. This is huge, huge thing in American history. This has been DBQ topics all by itself in the past. There's been essays, analyze the impact of the market revolution on women. So you bring in a social element. How does it affect slavery? How does it affect labor unions and working class? You could straight up just an economic essay. Right? Talk to me about the market revolution. Compare and contrast the market revolution of the early 1800s with the industrial revolution of the late 1800s. Variety of ways we can go there. So we'll break it down as best we can and get through it. So basically the market revolution, you can think about it as like kind of three mini revolutions all occurring at the same time. You have an industrial one. You got Samuel Slater coming over from England, bringing the factory system over here, setting that up in Arkwright, Rhode Island. You've got Eli Whitney, very influential early American, takes advantage of very strong patent protections in the Constitution, comes up with something called interchangeable parts. This means that instead of everything being made by hand, which means it's one of a kind, think about it. If you're making like a clock or a watch, all those tiny gears, and you're doing it by hand, the spacing on those gears is never going to be the same. So if one breaks, you kind of have to make the whole thing over again. With interchangeable parts, you can just swap out the broken part. Greater efficiency, faster production means cheaper goods. More people can buy them, more people make more money. The other thing Whitney does is the cotton gin. Heretofore, cotton had not been very profitable because it was incredibly labor intensive. You got to get the seeds out of the cotton fibers. Cotton gin will do that for you. The impact of this is exactly the opposite of what Whitney, he thought it would help end slavery, and it explodes slavery. Because all the Southerners are like, well, we can move west now. We'll go into Mississippi, Alabama, ultimately Louisiana, Arkansas, and make cotton the, quote, king cotton. The cotton kingdom of the Deep South is coming, built on the invention of the cotton gin. This then fuels industrial expansion in the North with the textile mills and the factories located along rivers. You have things like the Lowell system of Lowell, Massachusetts, where they use young single women as labor. So that's how you can get into the impact of women on this. We'll look at that a little bit later as well. So industrial stuff going on almost all in the North. That's going to be one of the big dividing points between North and South, is 90% of the industry is going to be in the North. Transportation, we're revolutionizing the way we move about the country. So that could fall into a demographic style essay, talk about movement of people and stuff like that. Immigration, all kinds of stuff. Robert Fulton comes up with the steamboat, turns rivers into two-way streets for us, basically with greater efficiency, because now you can push back up against the current. We'll go canal crazy. We build the Erie Canal. That's the go-to name drop example. See the picture of it there on the right. Then we build a ton of canals across the Midwest, because we're linking these growing river cities like Cincinnati, or cities on Great Lakes like Chicago and Cleveland, connecting them to rivers, connecting those rivers to bigger rivers, ultimately trying to get to the Mississippi. We'll build roads. We'll have turnpikes and private roads and bridges. The federal government gets involved. They build what's called the National Road, or the Cumberland Road, which in essence, for the most part, connects Baltimore, D.C. area out to roughly St. Louis, kind of those two major areas. And then railroads. Railroads are a little bit later, 1830s, 1840s, when we really see that technology take off. And they're just more efficient. Rivers, you kind of got to go where the river wants you to go, or you build a canal, which is time consuming and laborious. Whereas railroads, you build them where you want to go. And so we begin to link cities through railroads. Again, predominantly in the North. South will not really have a great railroad infrastructure. They don't have an infrastructure really at all, because it's all agricultural, cotton plantation based. And you have a communication revolution as well, as the telegraph becomes a thing. Morse code, Samuel Morse is the guy associated with that. The reason the telegraph is important is it provides for greater instantaneous communication. So then obviously the next evolution of the telegraph would be the telephone. And then if you wanted to go beyond your time period, right, you'd bring up the internet, things like that as far as communication. Greater information sharing, greater efficiency in communication means businesses can be more profitable while goods and services get cheaper, meaning more people can afford them. And that's kind of the process of industrialization as we go through the 19th century. Good God, who is that vampire on the left? That would be Henry Clay. He's probably still alive, living in some frontier Kentucky farmhouse, feeding on innocent people in the night that don't study for their AP DBQ essay. So Henry Clay's American System. It's a comprehensive plan for advancing the nation's economic growth. It's a fancy textbook definition. Basically, it's three things. We're going to have protective tariffs. Tariffs are taxes on imported goods, meant to protect American industry as well as raising revenue. Good for us. So American industries grow, you get money, you then use that money, deposit it in the bank, and then you can fund the building of internal improvements, roads, bridges, canals, railroads, things like that. It does meet some challenges. It's not entirely constitutional, right? Depending on your interpretation of it. Democratic Republicans aren't going to be in favor of this. Southern states aren't going to be in favor of this, as you can see down there at the bottom. Not a lot of factories to be protected. When we put high tariffs on countries, countries have a tendency to put tariffs on us. That makes European goods more expensive and our agricultural guys more challenging for them to sell their stuff overseas. The South isn't really getting a lot of internal improvements at all. So what you begin to see here is a division between North and South. As railroads and canals and everything begin to connect those Midwest river cities, Cincinnati, remember the nickname in the textbook is Porkopolis because of all the pigs that are there, the slaughterhouses. You're going to connect those cities with the big eastern port cities, Boston, New York. So you're beginning to, over time, by the time we get to the Civil War, have the kind of a universal northern culture, Illinois, Ohio, all the way through Pennsylvania to New York and Massachusetts, contrasted against the Southern society. And we'll get into that as we go forward. But again, North will be industrial, factory-based, more infrastructure, greater access to public education, and anti-slavery. And the South is pretty much the entire opposite of that. So the market revolution and then the concept of Clay's American System is really what begins to link those two parts of the country together. So this is definitely be a name drop and a quick explanation on an expansion essay, on a sectionalism essay if you got that, or even you could tie it into slavery debates and stuff like that on why the North becomes free, because again, factories and industrial labor, much less demand for slavery, and they've always been that way to a certain degree, and so they've already abolished slavery. So North versus South, we're slowly building towards that, and make sure you study. You don't want to find Henry Clay waiting under your bed at night. So what are some effects of the market revolution? You get a cause and effect essay. Obviously, the effects part of that is pretty important. Self-sufficient households begin to go away. This idea that everything's made at home, what's called the household mode of production, slowly going to start to fade away. Interdependence increases. So you have, hey, these guys do the pig slaughterhouse, and then you got to go to the market and the butcher to buy the meat, etc. So, and we're seeing that even today with the quarantine and all that stuff, right? All the food infrastructure, being linked together. Very much have modern interdependence on people. Back then, it's just beginning. The rise of the river cities, we've touched on that already. Western expansion. So for in the north, you have westward expansion towards those river commercial cities, and in the south, you have westward expansion for cotton production. Increased standard of living for most people, at least urban workers, does increase in the north. Huge pay gap still exists between the super wealthy and the super poor. Social mobility is better, and it's really only going to exist in the north. It's not the rags to riches story is still very rare, but you do have a greater opportunity generation to generation to climb up the social ladder in the north than you do in the south, and then especially compared to Europe. Impact on women, the Lowell system. So that's a name drop, but understand it is rare. It's not like suddenly all single women get employed in textile factories. The women that are working, you do begin to see a little bit increase in that. It's not huge. It's not 1950s or anything like that. but they're pretty much limited to being maids or teachers, your traditional kind of women jobs, and it's pretty much single women. Once you get married, you switch into that Republican motherhood concept where you're at home taking care of the kids, raising good young future like lovers of America and the Republican system of government. And then a huge impact on slavery. One, for the money you can make on cotton with the cotton gin, cotton production, westward expansion, etc. And then two, those textile mills are taking that slave produced cotton and turning it into textiles, which are then sold all over the world. So market revolution is huge. There's not a single part of the country that is not affected by this transformational change economically that's going on during the early 1800s. Okay, so we're kind of back to a little bit of presidencies because the other huge dominating figure of this time period is the man named Andrew Jackson. He's on your $20 bill, so you know he's important. You make the American currency, you're an important figure in American history one way or another. So Monroe, we talked about Monroe. John Quincy Adams is going to win the election of 1824. Andrew Jackson runs in that election, and nobody gets the majority of the Electoral College vote, so it goes to the House of Representatives, just like the 1800 election with Jefferson. And Andrew Jackson and his boys are going to accuse John Quincy Adams and Henry Clay of making a deal. Henry Clay would throw his support because he had been a candidate. He'd kind of drop out. His supporters would back Adams. Adams, upon winning the presidency, would make Henry Clay Secretary of State. Secretary of State is viewed as a stepping stone to being president. Pretty much everybody who's been Secretary of State has become president of the United States. So Andrew Jackson's boys call that the corrupt bargain. And so Quincy Adams will be there for 4 years. Jackson comes back with a vengeance, wins the 1828 election. We will go into greater detail for Jackson and Van Buren on the timeline. So I just want to jump ahead because there's not really a slide for this. After Van Buren, the Whigs will run William Henry Harrison and Jonathan Tyler as his vice president. So this is the Tippecanoe and Tyler 2, because Henry Harrison is the general which wins the Battle of Tippecanoe. Think back to the slide where we talked about the effects of the War of 1812. Military heroes spin that into political success. Jackson, Battle of New Orleans in the War of 1812. Harrison knocks down the Indians at the Battle of Tippecanoe. And they will run what's called the Log Cabin Hard Cider campaign. So this is basically saying like, hey, Henry Harrison, he's born in a log cabin. He drinks hard cider. He doesn't drink wine. He's just like you. Because Andrew Jackson will do that very successfully in what is known as the era of the common man. And we'll get into that a little bit more. But Jackson really kind of tries to position himself as, I'm just like you. Just like the common, average, everyday American. Matter of fact, his inauguration has a huge party on the front lawn, the likes of which you've never seen before. So Jackson is definitely a different dude. We'll get into him a little bit more in a second. And then Polk wins as a Democrat in 1845, and we'll conclude kind of period 4 talking about him. So you see anything document dealing with like log cabins, hard cider, it's an everyman campaign. The idea you're trying to relate to the average American voter. Because what's going to happen is as white male suffrage increases, so increasing the number of white males who could vote as property restrictions go away, politicians have to start catering to a larger and more diverse group of individuals. Right? And so we'll get into that with Jackson as well. So what does Jacksonian democracy look like? Well, number one there, right at the beginning, is the expansion of white male suffrage to include pretty much universal white male suffrage. Property restrictions begin to go away. Emphasis on the common man. It will be Jackson on the left there. You see the picture. He's depicted as the king, King Andrew I. So in the United States, if you see documents portraying a president as king, usually it's not going to be in favor of that particular president. We don't really like monarchies here. We fought a war against them. So depicting Jackson as a king, standing on the shredded Constitution, and all of that would be definitely a pro-Whig or anti-Andrew Jackson cartoon. So what does Jackson do? Well, he's very much going to increase the power of the presidency. Number one, vetoes more than anybody combined. Vetoes things like the Maysville Road, says that's a Kentucky thing, not a national thing. Will ultimately veto the bank recharter, which we'll talk about here in a second. The Indian Removal Act, in order to free up some land for westward expansion. He'll run the Indians out of town. Supreme Court says, hey, you can't do that. And Andrew Jackson very famously says, John Marshall has rendered his decision. Now let us see him enforce it. And basically highlighting the fact that the Supreme Court is just some guys in black robes sitting on a bench, yet the Army answers to the president. So that is the infamous Trail of Tears, specifically referencing the Cherokee. But the Indian Removal Act really does remove Indians from all over the United States to west of the Mississippi and further in the reservation systems. He also highlights the power of the presidency with the nullification crisis. South Carolina is upset with a high tariff. Southern states really are never going to be fans of tariffs. It doesn't really do anything for them. We touched on that as part of the Clay's American system. They call the tariff of abominations. They say it's unconstitutional. They nullify it. This harkens back to the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, the idea that states can nullify things they disagree with. Andrew Jackson actually gets Congress to pass the force bill, authorizing him to send the Army down there, but South Carolina backs off. Cooler heads prevail. Clay comes up with a compromise tariff. But these are all examples of Jackson increasing the power of the presidency, prohibits anti-slavery material from being distributed through the U.S. mail because the abolition argument is growing. And he also does what's called the Species Circular, where he's going to require Western land sales to be done in gold and silver. Banknotes lose money, or lose value. Paper money loses value. This helps ushers in the Panic of 1837. So good, bad, indifferent. Jackson is definitely increasing the power of the presidency. He's going to form his own political party as well, which we'll look at in a second, which is the Democrats. So he's predominantly a states' rights guy. Not always, like the nullification crisis, but very much a states' rights guy as well. But definitely increases the power of the presidency. So Jackson's going to go to war with the bank. You can see in the top right, he calls it a monster. There he is fighting it. Why is he going to go to war with it? A couple of things. One, he blames it for losing a ton of money in the Panic of 1819. And two, who wants the bank? It's part of the American system, right? He's going to try to fight that vampire Henry Clay because he hates Henry Clay because of the corrupt bargain. So Jackson is a guy that definitely holds grudges, considers the bank unconstitutional as well, and only benefiting the rich fat cat guys and not really benefiting the common man. Remember, that's what Jackson stands for. So he vetoes the recharter, starts funneling money into what he calls pet banks, which are state banks run by friendly Jacksonian guys, and starves it of money, and then ultimately the charter dies. It fails. It runs out of time. Jackson doesn't bring it back, and he's able to strike a huge blow against Henry Clay and the American system. Van Buren will follow him. And Van Buren and Jackson together, the other thing they've done is they've worked really hard to create the modern kind of political party. This idea of platforms and campaigning. The spoils system is also something huge that Andrew Jackson creates or uses effectively, otherwise known as patronage, rewarding political friends with jobs, rewarding loyalty with jobs. That way they work hard for your success and you have something to take away from them if they don't. And that becomes a theme in politics throughout the 1800s, really tries to get cleaned up in the late 1800s, early 20th century. Van Buren really killing the bank is one cause of the Panic of 1837. This smoke checks Martin Van Buren's presidency. Remember, Jackson's on his way out in 37. Van Buren is on his way in. And here's one of the worst economic crises of the country's yet seen. Good luck, have fun, Marty. And he's going to be a one-termer because of it. The Democrats will get blamed by the new party, the Whig party that gets created here, because of the terrible economic scenario that the country is in. So, sorry, Van Buren. Gets the nickname Martin Van Ruin. So the new party system, I've been talking about Democrats and Whigs. So the Federalists are gone. National Republicans will have split away from the Democratic Republicans. You've got an anti-Masonic party that has formed as well. It's an anti-secret society party. So there are some third parties whirling around. Basically, they all kind of end up being Whigs. And the old school Thomas Jefferson guys end up becoming Democrats. So you can see there on the left, Democrats, former Democratic Republicans, favoring local state rule, limited government, smaller federal government roles, free trade, increased opportunity for white males, popular in the South and the West and the urban workers, and things there Concerned about or issues of the day would be sectionalism, westward expansion, economic concerns, things like that. And then who are the big Democrats early on? Jackson, Van Buren. Whigs on the other side. These are former Federalists and your National Republicans. Remember, National Republicans were your pro-federal government Democratic Republicans, basically. Favored the American system of Henry Clay, popular in the New England and Mid-Atlantic, where the industries are. They're favored by Protestants of English heritage, urban professionals, elites, stuff like that. And then again, heavy hitters for them, Henry Clay, Daniel Webster. So Jackson increases the power of the presidency, forms a brand new party system, because the Whigs pretty much form an opposition to Andrew Jackson. So, and we use Jello to make sure you're paying attention, get your eyes open. So here's Jackson's impact. In the background picture there is depicting his inauguration party. People were passed out from imbibing too many adult beverages on the White House yard. So rough and tubbly's military dude. He knows how to get down. So you can see there, increases the power of the presidency. You can see his impact on the economy there with the bank, species, circular, and the panic. And then the political system becoming more democratic as more white men can vote. The modern party system. Van Buren starts cranking out the political machines, which have greater roles in the Gilded Age period of the late 1800s. But all that kind of begins to get created during Jackson's time. So I'll give you a couple seconds to digest the bullet points on the chart, and then we'll move on to the next slide. So here we have some social concerns and reform. We look at the reform movement as well. That could definitely be part of an essay topic. If you role of women, temperance, all these other things, and connecting it to the progressives of the 20th century and stuff like that. So you have the Second Great Awakening. The First Great Awakening was in the context for period 3. Second Great Awakening occurs. It's influenced by the democratization of America going on during the Jacksonian age. Similar to the First Great Awakening, there are disagreements between the new evangelicals and the old Protestant churches. It's slightly more unified, though. But this idea that's really central to the Second Great Awakening is also tied to that revolutionary nationalism spirit that you can determine your own fate, self-determination, right? We created a new government, we're new industries, like America's just a country of doers. We go out there and we do things. So you can do things and end up earning salvation as well. Have your good faith, hard work. This is Charles Granderson Finney's idea. The moral free agency would be the phrase you'd want to drop with the Second Great Awakening. Baptists and Methodists become the largest denominations in the country, very active in the South and on the frontier. Second Great Awakening is a little more embraced by the Southerners. The First Great Awakening, they flat out didn't want any messages about salvation and eternal freedom and stuff like that for the slaves. Second Great Awakening, you begin to see them bring in Christianity to use it as another form of control. Slave owners cherry picking lessons from the Bible that speak of being a good servant to God means you're a good Christian, so then they try to connect that to being a good slave. The slaves aren't really going to be embracing that. They're going to be much more entertained and interested in stories of like Moses leading the Israelites out of captivity, for example. These religious groups, they're activists. They become a kind of a nexus point for the reform movements during this time period. So you see women being connected to this, education reform, asylum reform, all kinds of good stuff that we're going to jump into here in a second. And then here is the picture is the Cane Ridge revival. You can see a bunch of people having gotten together. And then again, the eternal question, how do you get up in that huge box? Continuing with our culture discussion, we'll look at a group called the Transcendentalists. Transcendentalism is their movement. So the heavy hitter names you want to mention are Emerson, Thoreau, and Hawthorne. Those are the three. They're going to challenge the materialism of the period to a certain degree, focus on the individual's relationship with nature. You could also throw in Herman Melville, who wrote Moby Dick, could be part of this list. You can see there the third bullet, seeking the mystical and intuitive way of thinking as a means for discovering one's inner self and looking for the essence of God in nature. So the nature aspect really is highlighted with Thoreau, where he goes out to Walden Pond and writes eloquently about nature, etc. They are going to be anti-slave. They will participate in some of the communal things, which we'll see on the next slide. The big one for the Transcendentalists and kind of the early experiment in this is what's known as Brook Farm. So many leading transcendentalist intellectuals will spend time at Brook Farm. It's a shaping experience for them. And then they leave Brook Farm and go and are involved in other reform movements. So Brook Farm is kind of the beginning point for a lot of these people. You have a lot of very interesting, intellectual, eclectic people hanging out, sharing work. That's the whole point of a communal experiment, right? There's no real like concept of private property, and it's all the work and labor and everything is shared. And then they take that experience and how the new version of themselves shaped by it will go out and use that experience to fuel other reform movements. So again, transcendentalism, Emerson, Thoreau, Hawthorne, throw Melville on there too. Hawthorne and Melville kind of look at the darker side of it as well. Hawthorne does the Scarlet Letter, for example. And again, Moby Dick, very focused on the individual, the ego versus nature, etc. So continuing with the communal experiments, you have the Shakers, the Oneidans, and the Fouriers, or the Fourier phalanxes. Basically, you don't need to know a ton of detail about these, but collectively, they're seeking a utopian way of life. Remember, the world's changing. The market revolution is going on during this time period. And you see this again with the Industrial Revolution. Whenever the world rapidly changes, you see people sometimes are not comfortable with that. They can't embrace the change that's happening around them. And so they try to restrict and remove themselves from the culture. You see 1920s, the Lost Generation, 1950s, the Beats. They're not communal experiments or anything like that, but they are groups of individuals who kind of reject the society around them. With these societies, they're oftentimes religious based, and they have taboo ideas on sex and marriage. So the Shakers, for example, don't have marriage, they don't have sexual relationships or anything like that. And then the Oneidans will have multiple relationships, etc. So challenging the conventional wisdom, basically, is what these groups are doing. Really the only long-term successful one is the Oneidans, because they start making silverware, and so they create a product that can be bought and generate revenue for them. But again, these are kind of on the outskirts, but they kind of help pull society forward a little bit with these new ideas that might not have come about otherwise. But that's it, pretty much all we need to know about these guys. Okay, so here we have the temperance movement on the left, and then asylums and education on the right. So the temperance movement, largely driven by women, and we'll see this again in the late 19th century with, you can see down there in the bottom bullet there. But they're using moral arguments. Again, temperance is limiting the consumption of alcohol. There's also a prohibition argument thrown in here as well. Women are oftentimes the victims of alcohol consumption, either through their husbands working and spending all their money at the bar, coming home drunk, domestic violence, impacts the children, etc. You create the American Temperance Society early on. Will be opposed by immigrants, will be opposed by bar owners in the city type stuff. German Irish specifically during this time period. And this crops up again, and with the next major explosion of industrialization, you'll get the Women's Christian Temperance Union, the WCTU, and then ultimately does see success initially with the ratification of the 18th Amendment, which is the Prohibition Amendment, bans manufacture, transport, or sale of alcohol. And then that obviously is going to have its own unintended consequences. The 18th Amendment does, with the rise of organized crime. You have Al Capone, the mafia, stuff like that, making millions on liquor and the violence associated with that as well. On the other side, we've got asylums and education. So the name we need to know for the asylum reform, Dorothea Dix, asylums, Dorothea Dix. Looking at mentally ill, trying to help those people out. They'll create schools for disabled individuals, reform prisons, and then Horace Mann is the name we need to know and associate with education. He calls for free public education. It's not free in the sense, right? It's paid by tax revenue, but it's not a private school paying a tuition. And as part of this, you'd also want a moral education. So Catholics will break off because they don't want their students having a Protestant education, so they'll form their own Catholic schools. Second Great Awakening, we touched on already, will help fuel the creation of private colleges, which will be important going forward, because by the time we get to the 20th century, more and more people are going to school and seeking higher degrees. And that is a trend that will continue to increase into the 20th century as well. So we have women reform movements as well. We have, as we've changed the way people go to work, so as things begin to industrialize in the north and you're no longer working at home or working on your farm in many of these northern states, and you're going to a place of work, that creates the two different spheres. You have a public sphere for the man. That's where he goes and works, and it's unclean and it's dangerous, etc. And he's supposed to come home to the domestic sphere and be cleansed and recharged by his wife and her doting attention and the children, etc. So he can go out into the public sphere again. Another way to say this would be the cult of domesticity. And this really is where women become the mistress of the home. They take charge of the household. This is built off of Republican motherhood. Remember back in the early 1800s, women were not only expected to raise children, but raise good American loving children who are very much in the values of Republican government is instilled in them. And so you begin to see that forming and crystallizing for women. Women's debates on women's rights to vote, women's suffrage with Seneca Falls becomes a big thing. They're often tied to anti-slavery debates. So women will come to the conclusion that being married is basically like being legally dead or being a slave, because all your property goes to your husband. He has full control of everything. So you often will see women very much tied to the abolition debate going on in the country, and that'll be into period 5, which we'll get into on another presentation. Seneca Falls is definitely worth knowing, especially on an essay for women or just social movements in general. The 1848 first women's rights convention in history. Out of this, you will get Katie Stanton, Susan B. Anthony doing the suffrage movement, so pushing for women's rights to vote. That's going to be a long fight, ladies. So you're not going to get it until the 19th Amendment in 1919, 1920 time period. Women's rights will quickly get swallowed up in the country by the slavery debate. That's coming. That's the dominant theme in period 5, is the sectionalism and the abolition debates as we march towards the Civil War. And so women's rights kind of get swallowed up by that. Speaking of anti-slavery, it is the growing topic of debate, anti-slavery, abolition, however you want to phrase it. You have the American Colonization Society early on. This was a kind of a weak attempt to answer the issue of slavery. Keep in mind that you can be an abolitionist in the United States during this time period and be a massive racist at the same time. Many abolition arguments are not based on racial equality at this time period. That will come later. It's more about slavery being a contradiction to the founding principles of the country, etc. So the ACS was meant to basically establish a place in Africa to send slaves and African Americans back to Africa, specifically Liberia. Liberty, Liberia, there you go. The problem they're going to run into is by this time, 1830s, 1840s, it's not sending anybody back to Africa. It would be sending them to Africa because they're American. And so a lot of people don't want to go, and it's our one colonial experience, if you will. It doesn't really work very well. But again, we're trying to answer the slavery issue. You have the American Anti-Slavery Society. It's right there in the name, Anti-Slavery Society, as well as the Liberty Party will form, which is a political party, a third party, with the sole goal of abolishing slavery. And in period 5, we'll get a bunch of parties and we'll address, the formation of the Republican Party there. You also have some violent arguments for for abolition as well, calling for slaves to openly rebel. Nat Turner's rebellion is in part inspired by this in 1831. And once Nat Turner's rebellion happens, just like the Stono Rebellion previously, or any type of attempted rebellion in the South, that pretty much ends any debate on any type of anti-slavery abolition arguments, and the South will lock down even tighter. So they'll restrict a lot of things with slaves because, again, they live in a constant state of paranoia. And think about it, right? If you own a plantation, it's the husband and the wife, and then however many children they have, and if you're super wealthy, dozens of slaves. So you are significantly outnumbered on a plantation. And then next door, several miles away, is another plantation with the same thing. So their paranoia calls for a system that has very, very rigid controls on it, with a lot of nasty punishments and violence and threats of violence and selling and breaking up families, all kinds of terrible things. And so Nat Turner's rebellion ends any type of abolition talk in the South, and the abolition debate will grow in the North more and more, especially after period 4. So we have to talk a little bit about Texas, and it makes sense. We're in Texas, right? So in March of 1836, we're going to lead a revolt. Basically, that March is when they're going to get the big revolt happening, but the Alamo has already occurred. Battle of the Alamo, San Antonio, here you go. Go down, take the Riverwalk cruise, learn all about it. Battle of the Alamo pretty much kills everybody, the last man. A couple of days later, or a month later, really, Sam Houston catches Santa Anna at the Battle of San Jacinto, and we capture him, put a gun in his face, and tell him to grant Texas independence, and he does because he doesn't want to die. However, Mexico isn't going to acknowledge this. They're just like, this is a treaty under force, and yada, yada, yada. And so this creates a disputed territory, which sets up for the coming Mexican-American War. You don't get the Mexican-American War without having first taken Texas, okay? Texas applies for admission into the United States, and the United States is going to refuse. Andrew Jackson and Martin Van Buren are going to say, nah, Texas, we're good, because it would spark a big anti-slavery argument, an abolition argument, an expansion of slavery argument that they just don't really want to have in 1836. That being said, you fast forward, and you're looking at the presidential election of 1844, and Polk is going to end up being nominated by the Democrats on a big platform of expansion. He's going to want Texas, want all of Oregon, and all kinds of stuff, which we'll talk about. And he throws out the phrase 54-40 or fight. So that's the Oregon line. We want all Oregon, or if you don't give it to us, England, we're going to punch you in the face. And we'll talk about that in a second. So when Polk gets elected, he's going to think like, well, hey, the American people voted for me. I said, let's take Texas and Oregon. So we're going to end up potentially taking Texas. So the idea here is like, this is background information. You're probably not going to see anything on your AP exam specifically about the Alamo or anything. They avoid regional type questions like that because in, Nebraska, what do they care about the Alamo? But down here, San Antonio especially, we remember the Alamo. And we're going to remember the Alamo so much that in just a few short years, the United States is going to annex Texas. This infuriates Mexico. Why? Because they don't recognize Texas independence. They never did. So when the United States takes Texas, the Mexicans are like, oh, we thought that was ours. And then the United States is like, well, no, it's ours. So deal with it. So Polk, he got elected on 54-40 or fight, and we're not going to fight. So you can see on the picture on the right, you see 54-40 way up at the top. That was all of it. That's what we said we wanted. And we're going to settle for 49, which is where the line is right there in the middle, once we give up Vancouver Island to the English, etc. The reason we do this is we're getting ready to go to war with the Mexicans, and we think that it's probably not a good idea to have a war with England at the same time. You don't want to be between two people that are trying to punch you in the head. It's kind of hard to defend yourself. The compromise on Oregon will anger Northerners because you lose the northern half of Oregon, and that could have been free state territory, which would have marched towards the abolition argument. So you see Oregon involved in westward expansion debates. Definitely want to put that in an essay. Texas, Oregon, and then you're going to have the Mexican cession here in a second. You could have Oregon mentioned in anti-slave arguments, Texas mentioned in abolition arguments, Missouri compromise, Texas, Oregon, that kind of stuff. But at the end of the day, we compromise, and we get the 49th parallel, which is setting up the northern border. On the bottom map there, you can see what Texas looks like when it's annexed, and we'll have the debate over the rivers, which we'll see here in a second. So the annexation of Texas is what's going to kind of be a trigger point for the Mexican-American War. So we send Slidell down, dude, this is the guy's name, Slidell, his mission, go down to Mexico, and we're like, listen, let's break you off some change. We'll buy California, New Mexico from you, and let's settle the Texas border dispute. Mexico refuses, like, get out of here, America, we don't have time for you. And they're going to insist the border is the Nueces River, which is a river that's further north. The Americans are going to say, no, it's the Rio Grande River, which is the one where it is today, which is the Rio Grande is south of the Nueces. So Polk sends his boy, General Zachary Taylor, Polk's on the right picture there, Taylor's on the left, and tells Taylor, go down to the Rio Grande. And Taylor's going to be a future president, and he's a good general, so he's like, okay, we'll go down there. So we go down there, and so from Mexican perspective, we've crossed the Nueces, we're in their territory. Mexico will then cross the Rio Grande, and in the American perspective, invade the United States. And they'll actually capture an American patrol, they'll kill 11 soldiers. Polk then sends a message that he already has written. He's waiting for a reason to get a war out of this. And he's going to say that American blood was spilt on American soil, and Congress will declare war. Mexican-American War lasts for a couple of years. 1846, 1848 is when it's over. Spoiler alert, we win. You can see the map on the bottom. It's basically 3 phases. We fight up in California. We fight kind of in the central part of Mexico. And then we invade from the Gulf as well. And so we win. This war sets up period 5 in the increasingly acrimonious debate over slavery. Much in the same way as the French and Indian War created the environment for the American Revolution to occur, the Mexican-American War in large part creates an environment for the Civil War to occur. And we'll get into that in period 5, but it's what we're going to do with the land that we get out of the war, and how are we going to decide the slavery debates, etc. And we begin to pull more and more at one another, and then ultimately we end up in a civil war and secession, etc., etc. So Mexican-American War, very similar to French and Indian War in that it's a war, it happens, it's important to know about, but what it sets up is much more important. The American Revolution out of the French and Indian War, Civil War out of the Mexican-American War. So what are some effects that we get out of the Mexican-American War? The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo is what concludes the war. So Mexico will recognize the Rio Grande, so we solidify that issue. We'll take California and New Mexico. This is what's called the Mexican Cession, and it's the territory, not the state. So you can see in the background there, Mr. C's got mad PowerPoint skills for you. So that is the entirety of the Mexican Cession, what's shaded in the reddish pink color. We'll pay $15 million for it. You had some Whigs in the North. They oppose the war. We'll call them conscious Whigs. They oppose the treaty because they're like, man, it's a lot of land that could be used for the expansion of slavery. Some Southern Democrats are not really in favor of it because they wanted all of Mexico. So not just the northern, the territory in the modern day United States, but all of, the actual country of Mexico today, because that would have been potentially slave states, etc. And again, see, we're already starting to fight more and more about the balance in the Senate and slave states, free states, etc. They threw out the Wilmot Proviso. Wilmot was the guy's name. And basically this was an attempt to prohibit slavery in the Mexican Cession. It passes in the House twice, but fails in the Senate. This highlights why that balance in the Senate is so important if you're a slave owner, because the House already has more people in the North that are going to be pro-abolition. And so it has to be the Senate. And so the South is hanging on. And the territory that's gained down here is going to create big-time debates over slavery going forward, and then puts us on a path for increased conflict and sectional division. California is going to come in very quickly. They're going to discover gold in 1848, the gold rush in 1849, and then we'll look at what are we going to do with Arizona and all kinds of stuff out there. So this sets us on a path. Collision course, basically. Doesn't guarantee the Civil War, but it very much helps create a world where the Civil War can be a very likely outcome at the end of it. So period 4 will come to a conclusion in 1848 with America's victory in the Mexican-American War. So the next couple of slides are still information that's definitely we need to know. We're almost done, I promise. And this didn't really fit. I could, you have a slide with a court case here and then another court case later on. So I decided to put the big ones that we need to know just all in one slide for you. Marbury v. Madison, very critical. 1803 gives the Supreme Court the power to decide constitutionality of law. So this kind of answers the debates that Jefferson and Madison were having with the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions in response to the Alien and Sedition Act, saying that states had a right to nullify, etc. Well, in Marbury v. Madison, the Supreme Court will assume that power to decide constitutionality of law. McCulloch v. Maryland says states could not tax the bank, states can't tax the federal government, and also says that the Bank of the United States is constitutional. Gibbons v. Ogden addresses interstate commerce and basically extends navigation concerns to the Interstate Commerce Clause. Interstate Commerce Clause will be very, very powerful going forward for the United States Congress, even to present day. So Gibbons v. Ogden, interstate commerce. Worcester v. Georgia, originally said that Georgia laws had no force on Cherokee territory. Andrew Jackson's like, yeah, that's really cool, but anyway, we're still going to force them out. And this is where he utters kind of that very infamous phrase, John Marshall's rendered his decision, now let us see him enforce it. And so the kind of proves the Supreme Court only has power as long as we collectively agree it does. Jackson has the army, and there you go. Commonwealth v. Hunt is during the market revolution. This rules that unions are legal. So the Panic of 1819, which we'll touch on in a second, pretty much kind of wipes out unions. Panic of 1837 will further do that as well. But unions become a much larger part of our debate on American history in the second half of the 19th century and the 20th century. So Commonwealth v. Hunt is a labor union issue, an economic issue. Drop it in there. Unions are legal, good to go. And John Marshall, his court, we often name courts based after the Chief Justice, so in this case, John Marshall, rules in ways which strengthen the federal government. It's pro-federalist. Marshall's nominated by a federalist, and so he is going to have federalist decisions. Andrew Jackson nominates a guy named Tawney, and he will have more of a states' rights and kind of undo a lot of federalist stuff. The big one that he does is the Dred Scott decision, which we'll tackle in period 5. So we've mentioned sectionalism a lot. As we go forward, it becomes the big debate in period 5. So when we say the North, we're talking about New England and the Midwest. So Massachusetts, New York, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Indiana. That's kind of the North as we get into the 1840s, 1850s. Remember, those two, the New England area and the Midwest, were linked by the market revolution, the canals, the roads, the trains, all of that stuff. Growing industry, transportation networks, early union organization is up there. Increasing urban population, most of the immigrants are going to go there. Irish, Germans early on, and anytime you see a rise in immigration, you're going to see a rise in nativism or a pro-American, a Native American, not Indian, but Native American as opposed to immigrant. And there's some economic opportunity for women. Think of the Lowell girls, different things like that. The South, agriculture, dominated by King Cotton, slave-based agricultural system, plantations. Not a lot of room for poor whites to make any money because if I'm a plantation owner, slavery becomes my primary labor source, which means that other whites that don't have the wealth of land end up having to work in some form, largely in the slave industries. So you're a slave driver, you're taking them from A to B. You are an overseer, you're supervising them on the plantation on behalf of the owner. So there's not a lot of industry in the South. There's not a lot of free landowners in the South that aren't the super wealthy. Not a lot of cities. So you don't have a very large urban population. That goes along with why you don't have a lot of factories and stuff like that. The southern cities are located on the periphery, on the outside, basically, of Southern territory. When you look at it, New Orleans, Mobile, and Alabama. You've got Charleston and Savannah in Georgia, South Carolina, and then Tennessee, Kentucky area. These are commercial centers for trade. You get all the cotton baled together, you get it on the boats, you get it on the rivers, you get it to the port cities, or you take it to Nashville or Chattanooga or wherever we're talking about, get it on a train, and it's going to go north to the textile mills of the northern factories or to England for their textile industry as well. You do have free blacks living in both the North and the South. In the South, they're going to live in cities. They're not equal by state law, and they're constantly under the risk of being taken, captured, and basically forced into slavery or forced back into slavery. And little opportunity for women in the South. You're the wife, you're on the plantation or whatever. And so that's kind of the South. And then you have the West, the far West, or the frontier. We keep moving the Indians further west, so there's still skirmishes out there. Hard life, usually poor people. Women have more roles because there's just fewer people out there. There's not a Home Depot for you to go get stuff or anything like that. And it's hard on the environment during this time period. They'll clear cut forests in a couple of generations. And so that environmental issue, you could then play into the conservation period of the late early 1900s, right? So we pretty much smoke check the environment of the eastern half of the country And we're like, hey, maybe we shouldn't do that. And we preserve places like Yosemite, Yellowstone, places like that. And then obviously the Eastern economy or environment will recover over time as well. So oftentimes you can work environmental issues, humans' impact on the environment, etc. Always, College Board always likes to see that if you can work it in there as well. All right, so just some treaties, agreements, and panics here as we're grinding down. You've got the Russ-Bagot Agreement there. This limits naval power on the Great Lakes. Cool, awesome, thanks. Treaty of 1818, both Rush and Treaty of 1818 are with England. And, so joint fishing off Newfoundland, which is north of Massachusetts and Maine, basically. We'll jointly occupy Oregon, so that sets up the 54-40 or fight debate later on, and sets the northern boundary of the Louisiana Purchase. Adams-Onis Treaty is what ultimately gives us Florida, so that's going to be with Spain. Webster-Ashburton Treaty settles the border between Maine and Canada. Minnesota Territory again, so that's another one with England. We're settling the northern border. We talked about the Treaty of Ghent, which ended the War of 1812, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which ends the Mexican-American War. You have the Panic of 1819. Banks tighten credit to control inflation. This triggers a bunch of state banks to close, and it hits the West the hardest because everyone's speculating in land out there, buying land as investment to use it and then to sell it for profit in the future, etc. And so this tips the Westerners to become like kind of an anti-bank, anti-debtor prisons, which Andrew Jackson in the late 1820s, 1830s will seize advantage of. Jackson gets smoked in this as well, sets up why he dislikes the bank so much in part. In the Panic of 1837, we addressed this already with Van Buren. He gets elected Van Buren, and the Whigs will make great political success out of it. Panic of 1837 is pretty bad. Really hurts the nation for a long time. High unemployment rates, smokes a bunch of railroad industries, all that stuff. So mentioning those is being able to touch on them. You don't need to go into super great detail about them. Just remember them more as vocabulary words, and will be good enough for you on that. So what are some essay topics that could come out of this period? You could see a period on growing democracy. What does it mean? Who's included? Who's excluded? And why? And then that could be a continuity and change over time essay. So then the next big jump would be the Civil War, and then you would include the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments, and then women and yada, yada, yada. Westward expansion, continuing off of period 3. Not only we had the Louisiana Purchase in this period. We had Northwest Ordinance in the previous one, Louisiana Purchase in this one. The Mexican Cession, Texas, big chunks of land. Economics, market revolution. We touched on how important the market revolution is. Rise of unions, stuff like that early on. So you could see that comparing and contrasting the market revolution with the industrial revolution, for example. Things like that. Expansion of slavery, debates over slavery, sectionalism, basically is what that could be. And so that would be more like political. Reform movements we touched on as well. Women's suffrage, educational reform, temperance, Great Awakening, all of that stuff. And then the social aspects of women, slaves, and immigrants, putting that into an essay as well, really rises in this period, and then will continue into the latter half of the 19th century, early 20th century as well. So periods 3 and 4, chock full of information for you guys. Very easily see your DBQ come from this time period. It is the early Americans, right? Democracy, Republican forms of government. Political parties you could put on there as well as the second political party system, kind of a continuation of the first from period 3. So we go from Federalists and Democratic Republicans, and we end up with Democrats and Whigs. And then period 5, we're going to end up with Democrats and Republicans. And then at least, hey, the names don't change after that. So this kind of brings period 5 to an end. You guys probably are looking a lot like this poor fellow here, head down, passed out, having to be held up, just ready for all this to be over. And I promise it will be soon. But so we're done for period 4 today. Thanks for hanging with me for a little over an hour. As always, email me with any questions, and we'll be back in the action with period 5 quite soon.